Today, I had the opportunity over Zoom to connect with my friend, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, who has a PhD in evolutionary biology. He also works with the Discovery Institute and runs an online ministry called talkaboutdoubts.com. And we'll talk about that in the podcast. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Right. I'm joined today by Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. And as opposed to me trying to give some sort of great introduction, I'll just let you introduce yourself a little bit to give people a background of who you are.
Sure. So I'm Jonathan. I live in Seattle, Washington, and I direct an organization called talkaboutdoubts.com, where we offer free private mentoring over Zoom to Christians who struggle with doubts about faith, as well as former Christians who want to explore the evidence for Christianity. And my primary area of expertise is New Testament studies, especially historical credibility of the Gospels and Acts and how that relates to the broader set of arguments for the truth of Christianity. I also am a biologist, and I do a lot of work relating to evidence of design in nature, both in the life and physical sciences. In fact, I work professionally with a nonprofit organization based out of Seattle called the Discovery Institute as a resident biologist there. So that's a little bit about my background.
Great. Yeah. To follow a little bit of a rabbit trail for just a moment, I appreciate that you did a PhD in biology at a completely non-Christian school. That's correct, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you share a little bit about how that impacted you? It's probably a little bit of challenging to some of your beliefs, perhaps.
No, quite the opposite, actually. I find that the scientific evidence from biology for the existence of a creator is very compelling. And I've done multiple degrees in biology, bachelor's degree in forensic biology, University of Strathclyde. I have 2 master's degrees, one in evolutionary biology from the University of Glasgow, and the other in medical molecular bioscience from the University of Newcastle. And then I have a PhD in the origins of the eukaryotic cell division cycle. And I've often been baffled studying biology at the college level, both as an undergrad and then later as a graduate student, how anyone can go through a 4-year university program in the natural sciences and come out an atheist at the other end, because the evidence seems to me to be so compelling for the truth of theism, in particular, the information bringing properties of DNA and RNA, the hereditary molecules of the cell, the information storage, processing, retrieval apparatus that we find in the cell, the numerous irreducibly complex systems and machines that make biology possible, where you have multiple well-matched interacting components that contribute to some higher level objective. And if you remove any one of the components, the system ceases to function. And this presents a challenge to an unguided type of mechanism as envisioned by neo-Darwinians, because how do you produce such a system without knowing what the target is, one small step at a time? And intelligent agents can uniquely visualize complex higher-level objectives, whereas unguided processes can't. And so these sorts of features that we observe in life are not especially surprising on the supposition that a mind was involved in their origin, but they're wildly surprising otherwise. So yeah, I find the evidence from biology for design to be absolutely overwhelming.
Wow. Well, I appreciate that, especially because science was always hard for me in school. It didn't come naturally to me, but I really appreciate that you went in there and you went into an arena that wasn't favorable to your beliefs necessarily, but the evidence is the evidence and it speaks for itself. And that's really cool to hear. The area I think that you talked about briefly already in the introduction is the New Testament studies aspect of evidence of the reliability of the resurrection in the New Testament documents. Something you've proposed that I've been thinking on recently is it's called the maximal data approach, correct? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the maximal data approach is a term that was coined by Lydia McGrew, and it's in the term is to contrast it with the minimal facts case for the resurrection, which you might see popularized and pioneered by people like Gary Habermas or Michael Licona. Mm-hmm. And the minimal facts approach basically limits the data sets to those facts which are agreed upon by the majority of, or the consensus majority of contemporary scholars across the critical spectrum. So perhaps over 90% of scholars agree to a particular fact, then it can be called a minimal fact. And according to proponents of the minimal facts case, the case for the resurrection can be made using only those facts. And I would contest that. I think that I don't think that the facts that are conceded by the consensus majority of critical scholars are sufficient to make a very robust case for the resurrection of Jesus. In particular, Habermas fails to distinguish different types of appearances. For example, he doesn't carefully distinguish in his meta-analysis between appearances to individuals versus appearances to groups. Everything just goes into the appearance bucket. Or he also doesn't distinguish carefully between very minimal type of appearances, some sort of visions, or from something much more robust, such as a tangible, multisensory, intersubjective encounter, such as we read in the Gospels and Acts. He also doesn't distinguish scholars that will say that they tentatively lean towards a particular fact versus someone who says that they're very confident in a particular fact, right? So these are all very important distinctions that need to be borne out. And when Habermas or Lacona or other minimal facts theorists are pressed with some sort of hallucinatory hypothesis, it's not untypical for them to reach for facts which are not minimal facts by their criteria, such as the group appearances or the multisensory nature of the experiences reported in the Gospels and Acts. And so there's a bit of a bait and switch that occurs where the criteria changes midway through the argument, and that is problematic. There's a epistemic bottleneck problem where it doesn't matter how much evidence you have that the apostles saw something they thought was Jesus, unless you can say what these appearances were like, what was their phenomenology, it becomes very difficult to determine the rationality of the disciples' interpretation of what they experienced. Right. So the maximal data approach, by contrast, argues up front that the accounts that we have in the Gospels and Acts actually represent the testimony of the purported witnesses of the resurrection, and is prepared to argue against mainstream critical scholarship that the accounts in the Gospels and Acts are composed by individuals who are very well informed, very close up to the fact, and happen to be scrupulous. And having established then that these accounts actually represent the testimony of the purported witnesses of the resurrection, we need to give an adequate explanation for why they made the sorts of claims that they did concerning the content and nature of the alleged encounters with Jesus alive from the dead. And when we're evaluating any set of testimonial claims, there are basically three broad explanatory categories that give an account of why the claim was made. In particular, the claimant is lying, the claimant is sincerely mistaken, or else the content of the claim is true. Now, it doesn't look like the apostles were lying, particularly in view of the context of the claim. And in particular, and I'll quote here from William Paley from his book, A View of the Evidences of Christianity, published in 1794, where he notes that and he actually spends each of the first 9 chapters of his book defending this contention, that there's satisfactory evidence that many, professing to be original witnesses of the Christian miracles, pass their lives in labors, dangers, and sufferings voluntarily undergone in attestation of the accounts which they delivered, and solely in consequence of their belief of those accounts, and that they also submitted from the same motives to new rules of conduct. Right, and there's a torrent of evidence to establish that contention as well. And so that goes a long way towards establishing the sincerity of the apostles, because people are unlikely to voluntarily suffer hardship and persecution, imprisonment, or death on account of something they believe to be false. And so that shifts the discussion to the question of how the apostles came to sincerely arrive at the conclusion that they'd had encounters with Jesus alive from the dead. But when we inspect the content of the testimony, it's not the sort of set of testimonies about which one is plausibly sincerely mistaken. The encounters are to individuals as well as groups. They involve group conversations with Jesus. They involve extended discourses with Jesus. They involve physical contact on multiple occasions. They involve eating and drinking with Jesus on multiple occasions. They involve Jesus cooking breakfast for 7 disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. They involve they're in passages as objects, like the broiled fish passages in Luke 24. They're in different environments and settings. They're in Jerusalem and Galilee, outdoors and indoors, without prior appointment and with prior appointment. They're over a 40-day time period, according to Acts 1:3, so it's not just one brief confusing episode. It's really difficult to envision the apostles being sincerely mistaken about that sort of set of claims, if indeed these claims actually do represent the original testimony of the apostles, which is what I typically spend the majority of my time defending this argument, arguing for. So that's a summary of the maximal data argument. The context of the claim renders it very unlikely the apostles were lying. The content of the claim renders it immensely unlikely the apostles were sincerely mistaken. And so the best explanation then is that the content of what they alleged is in fact true.
Yeah, so that has a little bit, not in common, I guess it's very similar to the C.S. Lewis trilemma argument, right? Of liar, lunatic, Lord.
Yeah, exactly. And I've also defended that argument too. I think that's a very strong argument. I don't think that Lewis's formulation is the most developed or best nuanced form of the argument, but I think that that argument in principle is very, very compelling. If you want, I can give you a sketch of how I make that argument if you'd like.
Sure, go ahead.
Sure. So I've written on this myself at my website if anyone wants a more developed case for the Christological trilemma. The article is titled Liar, Lunatic, or Lord, Reviving C.S. Lewis's Trilemma. And basically, it's a two-step argument. The first step being to establish that the accounts of Jesus concerning his very provocative self-claims are historically credible. That is to say, that Jesus actually made very provocative claims of himself. That is, that he was Israel's Messiah, and he also made claims to divine identity. And that being the case, we have to establish why Jesus made these sorts of claims. It doesn't look like he was lying, particularly in view of the fact that he was willing to get himself brutally crucified on that claim. Right? And not only that, but he makes his impending violent death a core aspect of his messianic identity and mission. There are I counted at least 18 instances, unique instances, where Jesus predicts his impending violent death and connects it explicitly with his messianic mission. So one, and in my article, I go through a number of these and I argue for their veracity. So for just to take one example, in Mark chapter 8, Jesus speaks to his disciples concerning his impending violent death. And he says, he began to teach them, the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Returning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. For you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of men." Now, this doesn't seem like an invention on the part of Mark, particularly in view of the twofold rebuke. Peter, one of the leaders in the early church, rebukes Jesus, and then Jesus rebukes Peter, going so far as to call him Satan, right? That seems like a very unlikely invention, and particularly in view of the patristic testimony, which I actually think is credible, that Mark based his material on the eyewitness testimony of the Apostle Peter, right? So, and there's other examples that one could look at as well. Just take one more example. So in Mark 14:56, this is when Jesus is on the cross, and he's at his trial before going to the cross, before Joseph Caiaphas. And it says, many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, I'll destroy this temple that's made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build another, not made with hands." Even about this, their testimony did not agree. Now, this doesn't seem to be a whole cloth fabrication on the part of these false witnesses. It looks like a garbled version of something that Jesus said, right? In particular, a review of the specificity of 3 days, and also the fact they can't quite agree on what Jesus said. And in fact, when Jesus is on the cross later in Mark 15:29, the passers-by are mocking him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you would destroy the temple, rebuild it in 3 days, silver stuff coming out from the cross." Now, Mark doesn't provide a pretext for this allegation. The readers just left hanging. And this is a pretty serious allegation, especially in the context of first century Judea. But if we go over to the Gospel of John, in the wake of the temple cleansing towards the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Right? So notice that Jesus never said anything about destroying a man-made temple, rebuilding in 3 days, but not by human hands. John reports the original statement of Jesus, but not the later misrepresentation. Mark supplies the later misrepresentation of Jesus' words, but not the original statement. Right? So they can't speak together in a way that makes sense on the historical reportage view. And of course, the narrator, John, interprets Jesus' sayings. He says, "But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken." And by the way, this is an example of what I call an authorial aside, where the author, and John does this multiple times, he scrupulously distinguishes between Jesus' actual words and John's interpretation of Jesus' words, right? So, which is in itself, in its own right, a mark of historical scrupulousness. So that's just a couple of examples. There's more, but that's quite surprising that Jesus makes his impending violent death a core aspect of his messianic mission, especially in view of the Jewish milieu. Because and there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, the Jews of Jesus' time, the prevailing view was that the Messiah was supposed to be a militaristic leader who would overthrow the Roman occupiers and reestablish the Davidic reign. There's a lot of evidence for this, both in and out of the New Testament. So, for example, you can see evidence of this in Luke's nativity narrative. In Luke's nativity narrative, in the Magnificat, for example. You can also find it in the prophecy of Zechariah and the prayer of Simeon. So, for example, this is Zechariah's prophecy, where it says, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people, and has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from of old, that we should be saved from our enemies, from the hand of all who hate us." Right, and it goes on in a similar vein. You can also see hints of this in Simeon's prayer. "Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation that you prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel." The whole idea of the messianic secret rotates around this. That Jesus is often hush-hush about his messianic identity. And this is particularly emphasized in the Synoptic Gospels. And the explanation for this is supplied quite explicitly in John 6, where it says, "Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself." We even see in Acts 1, after Jesus' resurrection, the disciples are still asking, so as says, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" So there's a lot of evidence that this was the prevailing expectation. In fact, if you read Josephus, we see that there were around a dozen or so messianic pretenders around this time period, all of whom sought to fashion themselves as that sort of Messiah, the militaristic kind. Jesus apparently decides to forgo being that sort of Messiah and decides instead, "I'm going to be the sort that gets myself violently put to death in crucifixion," and makes it an aspect of a messianic mission. Moreover, according to Jewish law, Deuteronomy 21:23, it says speaking about someone who is put to death and being hung on a tree. Of course, Jesus is put to death and being hung on a tree. It says, "His body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance." Right. So, and of course, if you read Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho in the 2nd century AD, where they're debating, is Jesus the Messiah? Trypho, the Jewish philosopher, says, "These and such like scriptures, sir, compel us to wait for him who, as Son of Man, shall receive from the Ancient of Days everlasting kingdom. But this so-called Christ of yours was dishonorable and inglorious, so much so the last curse contained in the law of God fell on him, for he was crucified." In fact, he later goes on to say, "Be assured that all our nation waits for Christ, and we admit that all the scriptures which you have quoted refer to him. Moreover, I do also admit that the name of Jesus, by which the Son of None was called, has inclined me very strongly to adopt this view. But whether Christ should be so shamefully crucified, this we are in doubt about. For whosoever is crucified is said in the law to be accursed, so that I am exceedingly incredulous on this point. It is quite clear indeed that the scripture announced that Christ had to suffer, but we wish to learn, if you can prove it to us, whether it was by the suffering cursed in the law." So why would Jesus go to the trouble of getting himself crucified, violently put to death, if it wasn't even going to be persuasive to the Jews? If his mission was to convince people falsely that he was the Messiah, this wasn't the way to go about it. And so why go to the trouble of getting himself violently put to death for that mission? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And so the question then becomes, okay, so if and of course, actually, I'll quote Paley here because he puts it very eloquently in his A View of the Evidence of Christianity, Part 2 and Chapter 5. He knows that the Jews, whether right or wrong, had understood their prophecies to foretell the advent of a person who, by some supernatural assistance, should advance their nation to independence. This was the reigning opinion and expectation of the times. Now, had Jesus been an enthusiast, it is probable his enthusiasm would have fallen in with the popular delusion, and that while he gave himself out to be the person intended by these predictions, he would have assumed the character to which the universe is supposed to relate. Had he been an impostor, it was his business to have flattered the prevailing hopes, because these hopes were to be the instruments of his attraction and success. So it doesn't look like Jesus was an imposter, right? And so the question is it plausible he was sincerely mistaken? And there's a number of reasons to think that it's not plausible he was sincerely mistaken. The way that the argument is often hashed out by the likes of Lewis or G.K. Chesterton is to say that it's really difficult for someone to be honestly mistaken about being God without being completely nuts. And Jesus doesn't seem to be completely nuts, right? We see him confound his opponents in public discourse and so forth. We see that he's very sharp-witted. He exudes moral wisdom. G.K. Chesterton, in his book, The Everlasting Men, for example, notes this is exactly where the argument becomes intensely interesting, because the argument proves too much. For nobody supposes that Jesus of Nazareth was that sort of person. No modern critic in his 5 wits thinks that the preacher of the Sermon on the Mount was a horrible, half-witted imbecile that might be scrolling stars on the walls of a cell. No atheist or blasphemer believes that the author of the parable of the prodigal son was a monster with one-mad idea like a cyclops with one eye. But any possible historical criticism, he must be put higher in the scale of human beings than that. By all analogy, we've really put him there, or else in the highest place of all. And that was, of course, Lewis's argument as well. I think he probably was influenced by Chesterton. And of course, Jesus also doesn't seem to have narcissistic tendencies, right? We see him, for example, washing the disciples' feet in John 13, which was the very lowliest of tasks that was normally reserved for a household slave. In fact, this actually is what we call an undesigned coincidence, where you can actually historically corroborate this episode. This is only found in John, the foot washing. But John leaves unexplained why Jesus decides to wash the disciples' feet on this particular occasion. If we go over to Luke's Gospel, though, Luke chapter 22, the same event of the Last Supper, Luke does not mention the foot washing, but he does tell us something not found in John, namely that a dispute arose among the disciples as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors, but not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is the greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table, but I am among you as the one who serves, right? And there's other examples that show this as well, that Jesus doesn't seem to be a narcissist, right? We see him frequently try to deflect compliments, for example. And now I don't think this argument is that this particular, I think this point carries force, but I wouldn't want to rest the whole argument on it. But I think that you have a much more significant point, which really, I think, nails this argument, is that Jesus purported to be a miracle worker, and specifically a miracle worker in attestation of his radical self-claims. And the source of miracles that Jesus alleged to have performed are not the sort of set of miracles about which one could be plausibly sincerely mistaken. You can't plausibly be sincerely mistaken about turning water into wine, or feeding the multitudes with 5 loaves and 2 fish, or the raising of Lazarus from the dead, etc. These sorts of miracles, to say the very least, would require quite sophisticated sleights of hand. Now, so the question is then, well, do the source of miracles of which you read in the Gospels actually represent the source of miracles that Jesus himself purported to do? And there's a lot of evidence for that. So just to take an example, take the feeding of the 5,000, which is the only miracle aside from the resurrection found in all 4 Gospels. So in Mark 6, we read about the this event. Actually, let's go over to Matthew 11 first. Right. So in Matthew 11, Jesus announces the unrepentant cities of Chorazin and Bethsaida, saying, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." Now, what mighty works were done in Bethsaida? Nothing that Matthew reports up to this point gives us any clue. Now, if we go to John chapter 6, I'm going to put a pin in that question for the moment, and we'll come back to it. Now, in John chapter 6, it says, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him. So this is the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 narrative. It says, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so these people may eat?" Now, this raises an interesting question in the mind of the audience. Why did Jesus turn to Philip here in particular? Philip's a fairly minor disciple. He's not Simon Peter or the sons of Zebedee. Why Philip? You might even expect Judas Iscariot to fill the role here because he's in charge of the money bag. Why Philip? And also in verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, gets involved in the reply. And we wonder, why is Andrew getting involved in the reply? He's also a fairly minor disciple. Now, if we were to a completely unrelated text in John chapter 1, we learn that Philip and Andrew are actually from this town of Bethsaida. Now, John doesn't tell us where the feeding of the 5,000 takes place, but over in Luke's Gospel, in Luke chapter 9, we read, "On the return, the apostles told him all they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida," and that's where the event takes place. And so we can put the pieces together. John doesn't mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle story. Luke doesn't mention Philip or Andrew in this scene at all. It's only by putting them together, taking information from John 6, Luke 9, and John 1, that we learn that Philip and Andrew are actually from Bethsaida, right? Which explains why Jesus turns to Philip to ask where do we send people to buy bread, and what Andrew gets involved in reply. And also illuminates why in Matthew Jesus denounces the unrepentant cities of Chorazin and Bethsaida, right? And we have learned, of course, particularly emphasized in the Synoptics, that in just before the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus in Bethsaida was performing healing miracles, right? And also we see an episode in Mark 8 where Jesus heals a blind man in Bethsaida, right? He says he came to Bethsaida and then heals a blind man there, right? So now Matthew, although he talks about the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 14, he doesn't mention that it took place in Bethsaida. It's only in Luke. And Matthew sometimes narrates his material topically rather than preserving strict chronological sequence. It's only actually reading Luke's account that we learn that the feeding of the 5,000 took place before Jesus pronounced the woes of Bethsaida, which in Luke it's in chapter 10, the very next chapter. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you be done in Tyre and Sidon, they would repent and long go in sackcloth and ashes. So the accounts fit together in a way that makes sense on the historical reported view. But it gets better. So Mark also has an account of this event. He tells us the apostles returned to Jesus and told them all they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away from ourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So we get a sense of the hustle and bustle of the place. The busyness is extremely busy. They can't find leisure to eat their lunch. So Jesus has them come away to a deserted area to eat, right? And unfortunately for them, the crowds follow. We pick up the story in verse 39, where it says, he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, the grass in Israel is actually browns, right, most of the year, except a relatively narrow period of time during the spring because of the higher level of precipitation. In fact, here's a chart from Peter G. Williams' book, Can We Trust the Gospels, that shows the precipitation in millimeters at the nearby town of Tiberias. And you can see that the springtime is a time when you might well expect to find a large patch of green grass because of the higher precipitation. Now, if you turn over to John now, John doesn't mention the coming and going crowds, which in Mark supplies the motivation for being away to the deserted area, nor does he mention the green grass. But he does tell us in verse 4 that the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand, right? And so this explains why it's so busy. There's all these pilgrims who are descending on Judea and passing through the region en route, and also explains why the grass is green. It's the appropriate time of year. But there's more. So what's also interesting is that so Jesus not only performs feeding of the 5,000, but he also performs the feeding of the 4,000, right? And what's interesting is that the Greek word, the word for basket between the two accounts is different, and it's consistently different. Whenever the feeding of the 5,000 is spoken of, the word is kophanos, and whenever the 4,000 feeding is spoken of, it's the word spiris, right? Which are both translated baskets in our English translations. This becomes particularly striking when the two events are described in the same sentence. So in Mark 8:19, it says, Jesus says, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And there it's the word kophanos, it's the accusative form. And they said to him 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets spiridon, which is the genitive form of spiris, full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him 7. Right, so that's also an interesting characteristic of these, that you can see the consistency of the use of these different Greek words for the word basket, even though they're rendered identically in the English, which suggests that the event was impressed upon the memory of the eyewitness who preserved the distinction between the types of basket. There's also evidence that the narratives concerning the feeding of the 5,000 are independent of one another. And the most powerful evidence for this are the surface discrepancies that exist between the accounts. So, for instance, in Mark's account, in Mark chapter 6, the narrative begins with the disciples returning from preaching ministries to tell Jesus all they had done and taught, right? That's in verse 30. And given how busy the place is, Jesus tells the disciples to come over by ourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, right? That's in verse 31. But in verse 33, it says, many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them, right? And then the people came and met Jesus as he was getting out of the boat, and Mark tells us that when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, right? So compare this, though, with the account that we see in John 6. So John doesn't mention the disciples' preaching ministry, and they're coming to report to Jesus what they had done and taught. Nor does Jesus report Jesus' instruction. John doesn't report Jesus' instruction to come over us to death by some rest a while. That's found only in Mark. But John does indicate that Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which John calls by its other name, the Sea of Tiberias, in verse 1. And according to John, there was a large crowd following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick, in verse 2. And then in verse 5, Jesus goes up on a mountain, he lifts up his eyes, and he sees that a crowd is coming toward him, right? So if one were to read only John's account, you might well get the impression that Jesus had gone up to the mountainside with his disciples, and it was only then that he saw the crowd that had been following him. Now, going back over to Mark, so Mark speaking of the crowd, says that when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. In Luke, it tells us that it says that Jesus spoke to them of the kingdom of God and that he cured those that had need of healing. Sorry, that's in Luke. I'm in Luke 9. So when the crowds learned it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. Now, so John just doesn't mention the earlier part of the day, right? So from reading the synoptics, we're to picture Jesus having been with the crowd for some time prior to the feeding event, right? And so we're told that when it was getting late, they discussed where to find food for the crowd of people. But John just doesn't mention the earlier part of the day. So it seems that the crowd converged on Jesus while he had slipped away with his disciples, right? Mm-hmm. But this surface discrepancy between the accounts suggests that these are actually independent witnesses. There's other evidence like this as well, but there's other points of a surface discrepancy that can be harmonized, but nonetheless point to independence. There's also other marks of independence. For example, only John mentions the boy, they were barley loaves, right? That's in verse 9. Only John mentions that it was Andrew who brought the boy forward in verse 8. Only John mentions the other name of the Sea of Tiberias in verse 1, which is mentions the other name of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias in verse 1, which is a name that we can independently confirm from other sources. Only John records how far the disciples had rode when they saw Jesus coming toward him, which he gives an imprecise measurement in verse 19. He says that when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened, which in the Greek is 25 or 30 stadia. Matthew and Luke both mention that Jesus healed people, which is a detail not supplied by Mark. And only Mark mentions the disciples landing in Gennesaret, right? And which fits with the account in John, which says that they set off for Capernaum. So this further supports the independence of the accounts. There's also another example of Jesus' miracles is the healing of Bartimaeus, right, which we see in Mark 10, where it says they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples, a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more, and then Jesus goes on to heal him. Now, how did Bartimaeus know about Jesus? Right? So all 3 synoptic gospels mention Jesus healing the blind before this time, but these healings happened up in the Galilee region, several days' walk north of Jericho. So how does Bartimaeus know about Jesus' ability to heal the blind? Well, if we go over to John 9, we see that Jesus actually heals a man who'd been blind since birth in Jerusalem, which is much closer to Jericho. And in fact, this appears to have caused quite a stir, quite a commotion, because in John 11, when you read about the resurrection of Lazarus, it says some of the Jews said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have also kept this man from dying?" So apparently it had caused quite a bit of commotion, which then illuminates plausibly how the man Bartimaeus in Jericho heard about Jesus' ability to heal the blind. So there's a lot more than what I've shared, but this helps to establish that the source of miracles of which we read in the Gospels actually represent the source of miracles that Jesus purported to do. And as I said, they would require, to say at the very least, quite sophisticated sleights of hand. And so it seems implausible that Jesus was sincerely mistaken. We've seen earlier that it's very implausible he was lying. And so the best explanation then is that the content of what he alleged is in fact true.
Well, I think maybe the listeners are starting to see why it's called maximal data because there's a lot of data. I love that you mentioned things like the Jesus calling Peter Satan and Jesus being the kind of Messiah who is accomplishing his own death, not things. Some people maybe call that embarrassing details or details that unintentionally corroborate each other. And you touched on it a little, and we don't have a ton of time left, but there are the sorts of things in the Gospels that people look at and say these contradict each other because there's a lot of good cooperation. What about the examples of how many angels were at the tomb, or how many demoniacs did he heal? How do you deal with those kind of examples?
Yeah, so first of all, there's an epistemic asymmetry here because the points of confirmation of the Gospels on matters of detail are more evidentially valuable than those points of disconfirmation or these points of
Mm-hmm.
contradiction. There are supposing the historical reportage view to be correct, there are far more numerous ways in which we might be missing a crucial piece of information that would harmonize the text, or in which a minor good faith mistake might be incorporated into the sources. Then there are ways, supposing the accounts to be fictitious, that the numerous points of historical confirmation and matters of specific detail might have arisen, right? So, to put it differently, it's a lot easier to get things wrong than it is to get them right. Um,
Yeah.
and so there's an evidential asymmetry here, and the um, and also with alleged discrepancies, it is not at all implausible in many of these cases that we're just missing a crucial piece of information. That most of the accounts, most of the alleged discrepancies between the Gospels and are very easy to harmonize, or have very plausible harmonizations that one can adduce. So in the case of the angels, for example, that you mentioned specifically,
Mm-hmm.
so Matthew and Mark mention one angel, whereas Luke mentions two angels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Luke calls them two men, but the woman gave the interpretation of what they saw as they'd seen a vision of angels, right? Um, and we know from the scriptures that angels often appear as men, right? They appear as men to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, for example, in Genesis 18. The author of Hebrews says that some have entertained angels unaware. So angels appear often
Mm-hmm.
as men, right? But what about the number? So I think I don't even see this as an apparent contradiction, actually, because this is simply an example of what we might call literary spotlighting, where Matthew and Mark emphasize the angel who spoke, but um, but doesn't deny the presence of another angel.
Right.
Luke reports the two angels, so there's no contradiction there. If a
Mm-hmm.
gospel had said that there was one and only one angel, or
Mm-hmm.
that would be a contradiction. But to emphasize the one who spoke, and we do this all the time in our own lives, right? If I am with two people and I'm telling my friend about a particular interaction, and I say, Payton told me this,
Mm-hmm.
but Payton's friend was also with him at the time, and I just omitted to mention Payton's friend. Well, that's not a denial of Payton's friend
Mm-hmm.
being present, right? So I don't find that to be a particularly compelling example. And as I said, the vast majority of these alleged discrepancies dissolve upon close inspection of the relevant texts. But even with those that then there's a small handful of cases that I don't have what I find to be a fully convincing harmonization, but nonetheless, it may be the case that we're just missing a crucial piece of information, or
Mm-hmm.
even in the case of a minor good faith error, that doesn't really detract from the overall case for the very high reliability of these sources.
Right, right, exactly. I think that's dead on. As we begin to wrap up here, I go back to what you mentioned at the beginning about your work with talkaboutdoubts.com. I love what you're doing there and in these one-on-one conversations with individuals who go to your website. In your experience, what do you think the biggest thing is that causes people to fill out that form that they're wrestling with? And if you only had like just a moment with that person, what might you say to them about the evidence for your faith?
Um, yeah, so there's multiple lines of argument for Christianity. So there's the case for the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
There's the Christological trilemma. We've summarized those two arguments. There's a lot more depth that one could go into on those arguments, but we've given an overview. There's also the conversion of Paul. There's the argument from
Mm-hmm.
Messianic prophecy. There's the argument from modern miracles. I'll briefly summarize or sketch out the conversion of Paul argument, but I'll not go into the weeds. But I have an article on my website if you want to really do a deep dive on the conversion of Paul. I recently just published wrote a thoroughly revised and expanded version of an earlier essay I published on the topic that goes into defends the case much more thoroughly than I had done previously, even. But basically, it's a two-step argument. The first step being to establish that the accounts in Acts concerning Paul's conversion and subsequent miracles actually represent what Paul himself claimed to have experienced. And there's a huge amount of evidence to establish that contention. That being so, we have to evaluate what best explains Paul's testimony. It doesn't look like he was lying, particularly in view of the fact that he endured such tremendous hardships, sufferings, persecutions, imprisonments, floggings, being beaten with rods, stoned, shipwrecked, put to death by the sword on account of that claim, right? And that really goes a long way towards establishing his sincerity. He also anticipates that other believers will undergo similar hardships and persecutions, imprisonments, and suffering. He writes, for example, in Philippians 1:29, when he's writing to a church in Macedonia, he says, "To you has been granted for the sake of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake." And so, as Sir George Littleton pointed out in the 1700s, if he said these things without full conviction of his truth, he must have been mad. And worse than mad, he must have been the most hardened wretch that ever breathed. You can also make a strong case that he wasn't in it for the money or the power. He seems to have great financial integrity. He doesn't seem to be a narcissist. I mean, we've seen, for example, he's writing from Roman imprisonment to the Philippians, and he hears that some are preaching the gospel to afflict him in his imprisonment, and he says, well, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. So he doesn't seem to be a narcissist who's hungry for power. And I developed this case very, very rigorously in my article in much more detail. That being so, we have to ask the question how he came to sincerely arrive at the conclusion that he'd had an encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus and was subsequently able to perform miracles. And when you inspect the content of his testimony, it's really difficult to envision him being sincerely mistaken. His encounter is intersubjective and multisensory, so it involves multiple sensory modes, visual and auditory. He sees the light, hears the voice, has a dialogue with the voice, is told to go into Damascus, and be told what to do there. He also is also intersubjective in the sense that it affects not only Paul, but also his trial companions who hear the voice, though seeing no one, although apparently they do perceive the light. Paul's blinded by the experience for 3 days, later healed by Ananias, who receives a vision concerning Paul, and Paul a vision concerning Ananias. And then Paul has miraculous powers that he describes in his own words. He's writing to the Corinthians, Corinthians 12:12. He says, "The signs of a true apostle were performed in your midst." The Corinthians, of course, includes a contingent of skeptics who are critical of Paul's apostolic credentials. And there's a similar text in Romans 15 about him performing signs and wonders and so on. And then, unfortunately, Paul himself doesn't write in his own words about the content of those miracles, but we can make a very strong case that the accounts in Acts concerning Paul's miracles actually represent the information that Paul had given to Luke. And when we look at the content, it's really difficult to envision him being sincerely mistaken, right? He heals, on Cyprus in Acts 13, he causes Elymas or Bar Jesus to go blind on command after Elymas stood against Paul and Barnabas, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. In Acts 4, and actually results in the conversion of Sergius Paulus. In Acts 14, he heals a man on Lystra who'd been crippled since birth and unable to use his feet, a feat that greatly impresses the crowds. In Acts chapter 16, he casts out a spirit of divination from a slave girl, leading to him and Silas getting dragged before the city authorities because it disrupted the business of our owners. And they get thrown into prison in Philippi, and that night there's a miraculous jailbreak. There's an earthquake, and they and all the prisoners find their chains loosed. And this leads to the conversion, ultimately, of the Philippian jailer. It's really difficult to envision, cumulatively, that Paul was sincerely mistaken about that sort of set of claims. And since it's also not plausible he was lying, the best explanation is that the content of what he alleges is in fact true. And so the most crucial aspect of the argument then is establishing that the accounts in Acts actually represent the content of Paul's testimony. And if you want the details there, I have a very detailed essay on my website where I defend that, which is johnmclatchie.com for anyone that wants to check it out.
Yeah, I'll leave links to all of that stuff in the description of this video or on the podcast. So I think we'll probably end off about here, given that the attention span of the modern viewer is pretty short these days. So, but thank you, Dr. McLatchie, for all you shared. And I would encourage our listeners to go back through, maybe even listen to it a little slower and take some notes. on the verses that connect with each other. And I know it encourages my faith, and it just might encourage somebody else if you're able to share it with them. So if you have anything else to conclude us with.
Yeah, if any listeners or viewers are struggling with doubts about faith, then or even a former Christian who wants to explore the evidence for Christianity, please head on over to talkaboutdoubts.com. We'd love to connect with you over a private one-on-one or two-on-one Zoom call to talk about the evidence for Christianity. We have experts in a range of different academic subjects: New Testament, Old Testament, biblical archaeology, textual criticism, philosophy, the natural sciences, etc. We have around 80 volunteers currently. So if you want to reach out to talk about doubts, then please do so, and we'd love to connect with you.
Wonderful. It is a great ministry you're doing there, and I really appreciate you taking the time to connect with us today. And God bless those who listen.
Thank you.
You've been listening to What is Truth with Payton Arnett. What is Truth is created by Payton Arnett. Video editing by Matthew Taves. Theme music by Samuel Mowdy. Thank you for listening. God bless.